The silence of the Appalachian wilderness was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through skeletal branches. In the depths of winter, the forest became a cathedral of ice and shadow, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. It was here, in this frozen realm where civilization dared not tread, that Marcus Webb had chosen to disappear. But disappearance, he would soon learn, was never truly final. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some debts demand payment in blood and conscience. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The dog appeared on a Tuesday morning, emerging from the tree line like a specter. Marcus had been splitting wood behind his cabin when he first noticed the animal watching him from the edge of the clearing. It was a Belgian Malinois, lean and powerful, its tan and black coat dusted with snow. What struck him most were its eyes, amber and intelligent, studying him with an intensity that seemed almost human. The dog didn't approach, didn't bark or whine. It simply watched, waited, and then vanished back into the forest as silently as it had come. Marcus stood with the axe still in his hands, watching the space where the animal had been. Something about the encounter left him unsettled, though he couldn't say why. In his 9 years of isolation, he'd seen plenty of wildlife, black bears, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. But this was different. The dog had looked at him not with the wariness of a wild creature, but with purpose. With recognition. He tried to put it out of his mind as he finished his work, but the image of those amber eyes stayed with him through the afternoon. By evening, as he sat before his small fireplace with a mug of bitter coffee, he found himself glancing repeatedly toward the window, half expecting to see the dog standing in the darkness beyond the glass. Marcus Webb was 43 years old, though the mirror told him he looked older. The years had carved deep lines into his face, and his dark hair had gone almost entirely gray at the temples. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with the kind of wiry strength that came from hard living rather than gymnasiums. His hands were calloused and scarred, his knuckles perpetually raw from the cold. He wore the same clothes he'd worn for years, faded jeans, worn boots, a thick wool sweater that had been patched so many times it was more repair than original fabric. The cabin he called home was little more than a shack, a single room with a loft for sleeping, built decades ago by someone who'd had the same idea about escaping the world. Marcus had found it abandoned and claimed it as his own, asking no one's permission. It had no electricity, no running water beyond what he carried from a nearby stream. Heat came from the fireplace, light from candles and an old oil lamp. It was primitive, uncomfortable, and exactly what he deserved. He had come to these mountains after his discharge from the army, after the hospital stays and the failed attempts at therapy, after the night he'd woken up with his hands around his girlfriend's throat, strangling her in his sleep while he dreamed of war. She'd survived, barely, and had been kind enough not to press charges. But the look in her eyes when she'd packed her things, the fear and the pity mixed together, had been worse than any prosecution could have been. So he'd run. Not from the law, but from himself. From the man he'd become after 3 tours in the Middle East, after watching friends die in ways that defied description, after doing things that were necessary for survival but impossible to live with in peacetime. The army had called him a hero. The medals in the bottom of his pack said he'd shown valor under fire, that he'd saved lives and completed missions that others couldn't. But heroes didn't wake up screaming. Heroes didn't see the faces of dead children when they closed their eyes. Heroes didn't become too dangerous to sleep beside. The mountains had seemed like the answer. If he couldn't trust himself around people, he would remove himself from people. If civilization had no place for what he'd become, he would leave civilization behind. For 9 years, it had worked. He spoke to no one, saw no one except for the occasional hiker in summer months whom he avoided like plague. He survived on what he could hunt and forage, supplemented by rare trips to the nearest town, a hard day's walk away, where he traded pelts and carved trinkets for the few supplies he couldn't make himself. It was a life of penance, of self-imposed exile. But it was also a life of terrible, crushing loneliness that ate at him like acid, slowly dissolving whatever remained of the man he'd once been. The dog returned the next morning. Marcus was checking his snare lines when he heard the soft crunch of snow behind him. He turned to find the Malinois standing 10 feet away, regarding him with that same unsettling focus. This time, he noticed details he'd missed before. The dog was well-fed, its coat healthy despite the harsh conditions. It wore a collar, though he couldn't make out any tags from this distance. Most telling, it showed no fear of him whatsoever. This was not a stray. This was a trained animal, and recently cared for. Marcus slowly lowered himself to one knee, extending his hand palm up in a gesture of peace. The dog's ears perked forward, but it didn't approach. Instead, it turned its head, looking back over its shoulder toward the deeper forest, then back at Marcus. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. Every instinct Marcus had honed over years of combat and survival told him this was wrong. Dogs didn't behave this way. They didn't seek out strangers with such deliberate purpose. They didn't communicate with such clarity. But beneath the suspicion was something else, a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, and perhaps more dangerously, a flicker of hope. Hope that this strange encounter meant something. That the universe hadn't completely forgotten about him in his self-imposed grave. He stood slowly, his decision made. The dog watched him for a moment longer, then turned and began walking into the forest, its pace measured and unhurried. Marcus followed. They traveled for over an hour, moving steadily north and east through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. The dog led him along game trails he'd never explored, through dense thickets of mountain laurel and across frozen streams. It moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, never checking a scent or marking territory. This was not exploration. This was navigation. Marcus kept pace, his breathing steady despite the exertion. The physical demands of mountain life had kept him fit, and his military training had never really left him. He catalogued landmarks as they went, noting the position of the sun, the particular formations of rock, the types of trees. Whatever lay at the end of this journey, he wanted to be able to find his way back. The forest began to change. The trees grew larger, older, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. The underbrush thinned, leaving carpets of pine needles and exposed stone. There was a quality to the light here, filtered through the dense canopy, that made everything seem underwater, distant and dreamlike. Marcus realized they'd entered old-growth forest, a remnant of wilderness that had somehow escaped the logger's saw. The dog stopped at the base of a steep ridge, its face a wall of gray stone rising 50 feet into the air. Marcus studied it, seeing nothing but rock and ice. There was no path up, no obvious reason for the animal to have led him here. He was about to turn back when the dog did something extraordinary. It walked directly to a specific section of the rock face, one that looked identical to every other section, and began to dig at the base. Not the frantic digging of an animal after prey, but methodical, purposeful excavation. Within moments, it had cleared away enough snow and forest debris to reveal something that made Marcus's blood run cold. A ventilation grate. Small, square, made of heavy steel mesh, set flush into the stone. And from it, barely audible, came the sound of moving air. Marcus knelt beside the grate, his mind racing. This was man-made, industrial, and carefully hidden. He pulled the dog aside gently and cleared more of the area, following the base of the cliff. 20 feet to the left, he found another grate. Then another. Whatever lay behind this wall of stone, it needed a lot of air. The dog sat patiently as Marcus conducted his search, its amber eyes never leaving him. When he finally stopped and looked at the animal, really looked at it, he saw something that made his chest tighten. The collar around its neck wasn't leather or nylon. It was paracord, woven in a specific pattern. A pattern he knew intimately. A cobra weave, the kind soldiers made during downtime in the field. And worked into the weave were thread colors, olive drab and burgundy. The colors of the 75th Ranger Regiment. His hands trembled as he reached for the collar. The dog allowed him to examine it, sitting perfectly still. Up close, Marcus could see more details. The weave was expert, the work of someone who'd made hundreds of these. And stamped into a small metal plate attached to the collar was a single word. Ranger. Marcus sat back in the snow, his breath coming fast. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This wasn't random. This dog had been sent by someone who knew what that collar meant, someone who knew Marcus would understand the significance. But who? He'd cut ties with everyone from his old life. His family had given up trying to contact him years ago. His unit had scattered to the winds after their last deployment. And yet here was this dog, wearing the mark of his past, leading him to something hidden in the mountains. He looked at the ventilation grates again, then at the sheer cliff face. The military engineer in him, dormant but not dead, began to analyze. The airflow suggested a large enclosed space. The position of the vents indicated the structure was deep, probably extending far back into the mountain. The care taken to hide the entrance meant whoever built this hadn't wanted it found. But why? And when? Marcus stood and began a careful survey of the entire cliff face, running his hands over the stone, looking for any irregularity. The dog followed him, staying close. It took nearly 30 minutes, but he finally found it. A section of rock, about 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, that wasn't quite the same color as the surrounding stone. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were specifically searching. He pressed against it, pushed, pulled. Nothing. It was solid as the mountain itself. He stepped back, frustration mounting. The dog, which had been watching his efforts, suddenly moved forward. It approached the suspicious section of wall and, with deliberate precision, pressed its nose against a small protruding stone at ground level, no larger than a fist. There was a soft click, barely audible, and then a low mechanical hum began to vibrate through the soles of Marcus's boots. The section of cliff face began to move. Not swinging open like a door, but retracting smoothly into the mountain, revealing a gap that widened with each passing second. Behind it was not raw cave, but a steel door, massive and industrial, with a wheel lock like a bank vault. And the wheel was slowly beginning to turn on its own, disengaging internal locks with precise, oiled clicks. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his hip, reaching for a weapon that hadn't been there in 9 years. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every nerve in his body screamed danger, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away. The wheel completed its rotation, and with a pneumatic hiss, the vault door swung inward, spilling warm yellow light out into the frozen forest. The dog walked forward without hesitation, crossing the threshold into the light. It stopped just inside and looked back at Marcus, waiting. The message was clear. This is what I brought you to see. This is why I found you. Marcus stood at the boundary between his world of isolation and whatever lay beyond that door. His mind catalogued the impossibilities. The hidden entrance, the automated systems still functioning, the trained dog with military markings leading him here with obvious intent. None of it made sense. All of it screamed trap. But beneath the fear and confusion was something else, something he'd thought long dead. Curiosity. Purpose. The feeling that perhaps his exile was not meant to be permanent. That perhaps, after 9 years of running from his past, the past had finally found him and was offering him a choice. He could walk away. Return to his cabin, to his careful routine of survival and penance. Pretend he'd never seen this place, never met this dog. Let the mountain keep its secrets. Or he could step forward into the light. Accept whatever mission or message or horror waited inside. Become, once again, a man with a purpose beyond mere existence. The dog waited, patient and knowing. The door stood open, inviting and ominous. The forest behind him whispered with wind through winter branches, the only sound in a world holding its breath. Marcus Webb took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked forward into the light. Behind him, the door began to swing closed with the inexorable finality of a tomb being sealed. The dog fell into step beside him, and together they moved down a corridor carved from living rock, lined with steel and lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with power. The air was warm and dry, sterile in a way that reminded him of military installations. Of places designed for secrecy and purpose. The corridor extended 50 feet before opening into a wider chamber. As Marcus emerged, motion sensors triggered additional lighting, and what he saw stopped him dead. It was a control room, or had been. Banks of monitors lined one wall, most dark but some flickering with static. A desk held computer equipment, old but well-maintained, its surfaces covered in dust but showing no signs of water damage or decay. Filing cabinets stood against another wall. A door to the right was marked with a faded placard reading barracks. Another to the left said storage. But it was the map on the far wall that drew his eye and made his breath catch. It was a topographical map of the surrounding mountains, marked with symbols and notations in military shorthand. And overlaid on it, in red marker, was a network of lines and nodes that covered hundreds of square miles. He stepped closer, his old training kicking in as he decoded the markings. Each node was numbered. Each line represented a connection. And at the center of it all, marked with a heavy red circle, was a location labeled Site Prime. Marcus heard a soft whine and turned to see the dog sitting beside a desk chair, looking pointedly at a computer screen. He approached cautiously and touched the mouse. The screen flickered to life, showing a simple interface with a single icon labeled for Ranger Web. Open video file. His blood turned to ice. This was specifically for him. Someone had known he would come here. Had known the dog would find him. Had prepared this message and waited for this exact moment. With a trembling hand, he clicked the icon. The video was grainy, the timestamp showing it had been recorded 3 months ago. The face that appeared on screen was one he'd never expected to see again. Captain Richard Dalton, his former commanding officer, a man who'd been declared killed in action 7 years ago in Syria. But here he was, alive, though he looked like a man living on borrowed time. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. He sat in what appeared to be this very control room, though the equipment behind him looked more functional in the recording. Marcus, Dalton began, his voice rough and strained. If you're watching this, it means Kilo found you. It means I was right about where you'd gone, even if it took him longer than I'd hoped. I'm sorry to drag you back into this world. God knows you've earned your peace. But I have no one else I can trust, and what I've found here is too important to die with me. Dalton paused, seeming to gather his strength. The mission in Syria, the one that supposedly killed me, it was a setup. Not by the enemy, but by our own people. I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see, communications between a black site facility and certain elements within the intelligence community. They decided I was too much of a liability, so they arranged my death. But I survived, barely. I've spent the last 7 years following leads, piecing together the truth. And Marcus, the truth is so much worse than I ever imagined. The captain leaned forward, his intensity burning through the screen. There's a network of secret prisons scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Not official black sites, not rendition facilities. Something else entirely. Places where people disappear, not enemy combatants, but American citizens. Whistleblowers, journalists, activists, anyone who gets too close to the wrong truth. They're taken, processed, and buried in these facilities. Some are interrogated. Some are simply warehoused. None are ever meant to see daylight again. Marcus felt his legs weaken. He gripped the edge of the desk, his mind refusing to process what he was hearing. This control station, Dalton continued, was the nerve center for the entire network. I found it 6 months ago, abandoned but still functional. The computers here contain the locations of every facility, the names of every prisoner, the identities of everyone involved in the operation. It's all here, Marcus. The proof that our government has been running a domestic gulag for at least 2 decades. The captain's face grew darker, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But I made a mistake. I got careless. They tracked me here. I'm compromised. By the time you see this, I'll either be dead or wishing I was. But the data is safe. I've encrypted it, hidden it in a way that only someone with the right training can access. And I've sent Kilo to find you because you're the only person I trust to know what to do with it. Dalton looked directly into the camera, his eyes pleading. The main facility, Site Prime, it's only 8 miles from where you're standing. It's the largest one, the heart of the operation. There are people in there, Marcus. Good people who stumbled onto the wrong secret or asked the wrong questions. They've been disappeared, but they're not dead. Not yet. But without intervention, without someone willing to do what needs to be done, they will be. He paused, his voice breaking slightly. I know what I'm asking. I know you left this life behind, and you had good reasons. But I've seen what you're capable of. I've seen you do the impossible when it mattered. And this matters, Marcus. This is everything we thought we were fighting for. The truth. Justice. Protecting the innocent. It's all here, waiting for someone brave enough to shine a light on it. The captain reached forward, his hand moving toward the camera. The access codes are in the dog's collar. Kilo knows the way to Site Prime. He's been trained for this his entire life, trained to be a key that only opens for the right person. Trust him. And Marcus, if you choose to walk away, I understand. You've given enough. You've sacrificed enough. No one could ask more. But if you can find it in yourself to fight one more time, to be a soldier one more time for the right reasons, then please. Please finish what I started. The video ended, the screen going black. Marcus stood in the silence of the underground chamber, Dalton's words echoing in his mind. The dog, Kilo, sat beside him, patient and watchful, waiting for him to make a choice. Marcus walked slowly around the control room, his soldier's eye taking in details now. The facility was old, probably built during the Cold War as part of some continuity of government program. The maps showed a massive underground complex, tunnels connecting multiple chambers, designed to house dozens of personnel for extended periods. Someone had repurposed it, turned it from a refuge into a command center for something dark and illegal. He opened the filing cabinets, finding them full of documents. Operations summaries. Personnel rosters. Budget allocations with classified designations. And folders, hundreds of folders, each labeled with a name and a number. He pulled one at random. Jennifer Marks, environmental journalist, disappeared in 2019 while investigating illegal dumping by a defense contractor. Status, detained Site Prime. Another. Thomas Brennan, former NSA analyst, disappeared in 2016 after attempting to contact congressional oversight about domestic surveillance abuses. Status, detained Site 7. Another. Sarah Chen, civil rights attorney, disappeared in 2021 while representing families of people killed in questionable drone strikes. Status, detained Site Prime. The folders went on, a catalog of the vanished, each one a life erased, a story silenced. Marcus felt a rage building in him that he hadn't experienced in years, clean and focused and righteous. These weren't enemy combatants. These weren't terrorists. These were people who'd tried to do the right thing and been punished for it in the most terrible way imaginable. He returned to the computer and began exploring the system. Dalton hadn't been exaggerating. The files here were comprehensive, meticulous. Locations, guard schedules, prisoner manifests, communication protocols. Everything you'd need to understand the operation and, potentially, to dismantle it. But one file stood out, marked with a red warning label. Scheduled termination, Site Prime. He opened it, his hands clenched into fists. It was a list of 43 names, each with a date beside it. The dates ranged from next week to 2 months from now. A purge. They were going to execute everyone at Site Prime and close the facility. Marcus looked at the dates again, his mind calculating. The first executions were scheduled for 5 days from now. 5 days to do what? Rescue dozens of people from a fortified underground prison? Alert the authorities? And tell them what? That a dead soldier had left him a video about a secret Gulag network? They'd lock him up as delusional before he finished the sentence. No. If this was real, if Site Prime existed and held the prisoners these files claimed, then the authorities couldn't be trusted. Some of them were probably involved, their names in those very documents. This couldn't be solved by going through proper channels. This required direct action. This required exactly the kind of war crime his commanders would have court-martialed him for suggesting. This required a soldier willing to step outside the law to serve a higher justice. He looked down at Kilo, the dog that had been trained its entire life for this moment. Trained to find him, to bring him here, to open doors only he could open. Dalton had called the dog a key, but he was more than that. He was a legacy, a torch passed from one soldier to another, carrying the weight of an unfinished mission. Marcus thought of his cabin, of the solitary life he'd built. Of the safety of isolation, the comfort of having no responsibility beyond his own survival. He thought of the nightmares that still woke him, the memories that made his hands shake. He thought of all the reasons he'd left the world behind and convinced himself it was the only way to protect others from the weapon he'd become. But what Dalton was asking him to do wasn't protection. It was liberation. Not fighting for abstractions or geopolitical strategies, but for real people with names and faces who were suffering in darkness, waiting for someone to remember they existed. The rage in his chest crystallized into something harder, colder. Into purpose. Into the kind of mission clarity he hadn't felt since his last deployment, the kind that made everything simple. There was a wrong that needed to be made right. There were people who needed to be saved. And there was an enemy that needed to be stopped. Marcus Webb had run from being a soldier because he'd believed soldiers only brought death. But perhaps he'd been wrong. Perhaps the real question wasn't whether he could fight, but what he chose to fight for. He pulled up the map of Site Prime on the computer, studying the approaches, the defenses, the layout. It was going to be impossible. One man against a fortified facility with professional security, trying to extract dozens of prisoners through miles of hostile terrain in winter. The odds were absurd. The risk was suicidal. And yet, he found himself smiling for the first time in years, a grim, hard expression that was equal parts anticipation and resignation. He'd thought his war was over, that he'd fought his last battle and could finally lay down his arms. But some wars don't end until they're won, and some soldiers don't get to choose when they're called back to duty. He looked down at Kilo, who met his gaze with those knowing amber eyes. The dog had completed his mission. He'd found Marcus, delivered the message, and opened the door. Now the choice was Marcus's alone. Walk away, or walk forward into one final battle that would either redeem him or destroy him. Marcus reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the warmth of living fur, the steady beat of a loyal heart. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You did good. You brought me home." Then he turned to the computer and began downloading files, copying everything onto a small drive he found in one of the drawers. He studied the maps, memorizing the layout of Site Prime, the guard rotations, the shift changes. He opened the storage room and found weapons, body armor, and supplies, all carefully maintained. Dalton had prepared for this contingency, had left everything Marcus would need to finish the mission. As he worked, a calm settled over him, the kind that came before every major operation. The fear didn't disappear, but it became background noise, something to be acknowledged and set aside. What mattered now was the plan, the execution, the mission objective. Save the prisoners. Expose the conspiracy. Survive if possible, but survival was secondary to success. He checked his watch. 5 days until the first scheduled execution. Which meant he had 4 days to prepare, to scout Site Prime, to understand what he was up against. And then, on that 5th day, Marcus Webb would do what he'd always done best. He would become a ghost in the night, a soldier with nothing to lose and everything to prove. He would walk into hell with a dog at his side and righteousness in his heart. And God help anyone who stood in his way. The 4 days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and reconnaissance that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Marcus moved through the routines with muscle memory, his body remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Each morning began in darkness, checking weapons, reviewing intelligence, planning contingencies. Each afternoon was spent in the forest, moving closer to Site Prime, observing patterns, counting guards, mapping the terrain. Each evening ended in the control room, updating his plans, refining his approach, accepting the reality that what he was about to attempt should be impossible. Kilo proved invaluable in ways that went beyond companionship. The dog moved through the forest with supernatural stealth, his senses far keener than any human's. On their second scouting mission, he'd alerted Marcus to a patrol pattern that would have walked right over their position. On the third day, he'd led Marcus to a concealed observation point that offered perfect line of sight to Site Prime's main entrance. The dog wasn't just trained, he was a tactical asset, reading terrain and threats with an intelligence that bordered on uncanny. Site Prime itself was everything the files had promised and worse. It sat in a natural bowl valley, surrounded by steep ridges that made approach difficult and observation easier. The main entrance was disguised as an abandoned mining operation, complete with rusted equipment and warning signs about structural instability. But through his binoculars, Marcus could see the telltale signs of active security. Cameras disguised as dead tree branches. Motion sensors hidden in the underbrush. And guards, at least a dozen of them on rotating shifts, all armed with military-grade weapons and moving with professional discipline. The facility wasn't government issue. The guards wore no uniforms, no identifying patches or insignia. They were contractors, mercenaries, deniable assets hired to do work that official personnel couldn't be associated with. Marcus recognized the type, men who'd served in legitimate forces before discovering that moral flexibility paid better than patriotism. They were dangerous not because they believed in anything, but because they believed in nothing except the paycheck. From his hidden perch among the rocks, Marcus watched the shift changes, noting the exact times, the routes the guards took, the spots where their coverage overlapped and where gaps appeared. He observed the entrance protocol, how vehicles were checked, how personnel were verified. He noted the communication patterns, the regular radio checks every 30 minutes, the way supervisors made rounds every 2 hours. All of it went into his mental database, building a three-dimensional map of the facility's security apparatus. On the fourth day, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Marcus made his final approach to what would be his staging point. It was a small cave, barely large enough for him and Kilo, situated on the ridge directly above Site Prime. From here, he had an unobstructed view of the entire compound. From here, tomorrow night, he would begin the operation that would either free dozens of innocent people or get them all killed. He settled into the cave as darkness fell, Kilo curled beside him for warmth. The dog's presence was comforting in ways Marcus hadn't expected. For 9 years, he'd been alone by choice, convinced that isolation was safety. But having this animal beside him, feeling the steady rhythm of its breathing, the warmth of its body, reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That connection could be strength rather than weakness. That trust could be given without fear of betrayal. That loyalty, real loyalty, was something worth fighting for. Marcus pulled out the drive containing all of Dalton's intelligence and connected it to a ruggedized tablet he'd found in the storage room. He reviewed the prisoner manifest one more time, committing faces to memory. 43 people scheduled for termination, starting tomorrow. The oldest had been in prison for 6 years, the newest for 3 months. Their crimes ranged from investigative journalism to legal advocacy to simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time and seeing something they shouldn't have. One file caught his attention more than the others. A woman named Elizabeth Cormier, former FBI agent who'd been investigating corruption within the Bureau's own ranks. She'd uncovered communications suggesting that certain officials were feeding information to private security contractors, essentially running interference for illegal operations in exchange for post-retirement positions. She'd reported her findings to her supervisors, and 3 days later, she'd disappeared during her morning jog. That was 18 months ago. According to the files, she was being held in cell Block C, maximum security section. Marcus studied her photo. She was in her late 30s, with sharp features and eyes that looked like they missed nothing. The file noted she had combat training, firearms qualifications, tactical experience. If he could reach her first, if he could get her armed and mobile, she could be an ally rather than just another person to evacuate. It was a risk, trusting someone he'd never met. But the alternative was trying to shepherd 43 terrified civilians through a combat zone with no help. He'd take the risk. He pulled up the facility schematics again, this time focusing on the internal layout. Site Prime had been built into an existing cave system, with additional tunnels and chambers excavated over decades. The main entrance led to a security checkpoint, beyond which lay the administrative section. From there, corridors branched to the guard quarters, the interrogation wing, and the cell blocks. 3 separate cell blocks, actually. Block A for low-risk detainees, Block B for medium risk, and Block C for high risk, those deemed most dangerous to the operation. The ventilation system was the key, Marcus realized. Like all underground facilities, Site Prime needed constant air circulation to prevent carbon dioxide buildup and maintain livable conditions. The file showed a network of ducts and shafts connecting every section of the facility to a central air handling unit. The ducts were too small for a person to crawl through, but they offered something almost as valuable. A way to introduce chaos. Marcus opened another file, this one detailing the facility's emergency protocols. In case of fire, all cell block doors automatically unlock to prevent prisoners from being trapped. It was a safety requirement, probably mandated by whoever had originally designed the place. The contractors running Site Prime couldn't override it without expensive retrofitting that would leave traces of their modifications. So they'd simply gambled that no fire would ever occur in a facility where smoking was prohibited and all electrical systems were monitored. They'd gambled wrong. Marcus spent the next several hours refining his plan, working through scenarios, anticipating problems. The beauty of it was the simplicity. He didn't need to fight his way through the main entrance. He didn't need to overcome dozens of armed guards in direct combat. He just needed to create enough confusion and panic that the facility would tear itself apart from within. The first step was cutting external communications. Site Prime maintained contact with its oversight network through a satellite uplink position on the ridge above the main entrance. Marcus had spotted it during his reconnaissance, disguised as weather monitoring equipment. Destroying it would be simple, a few well-placed shots from a suppressed rifle. Once the facility went dark, they'd follow protocol and send someone to investigate. That someone would never make it back. The second step was triggering the fire suppression system. The ventilation ducts connected to a central air handler located in a utility building separate from the main facility. If Marcus could introduce smoke into that system, sensors would detect it and activate emergency protocols throughout Site Prime. Cell doors would unlock. Alarm systems would activate. And in the confusion, while guards scrambled to respond to a fire that didn't exist, Marcus would breach the facility and reach the prisoners. The third step was the hardest. Evacuating 43 people through hostile terrain in winter, while potentially being pursued by armed contractors who had every incentive to ensure no witnesses survived. For this, Marcus would need to rely on something he'd found in the storage room, old NATO-issue survival packs, one for each prisoner. They contained thermal blankets, emergency rations, water purification tablets, and most importantly, GPS beacons that would activate once they were clear of the facility's signal jamming. The plan required split-second timing, absolute commitment, and a healthy dose of luck. It would either work spectacularly or fail catastrophically, with no middle ground. Marcus was comfortable with those odds. He'd operated under worse conditions with less intelligence and fewer resources. The difference this time was what he was fighting for. Not national interests or strategic objectives, but human lives. Real people who deserved a chance to go home. As midnight approached, Marcus allowed himself a few hours of sleep. Not deep sleep, never deep sleep, but the light combat rest that let the body recover while the mind stayed alert to danger. Kilo remained on watch, his ears tracking every sound in the darkness. The dog understood, in whatever way dogs understood such things, that tomorrow would be different. That the waiting was almost over. Marcus woke 2 hours before dawn on the 5th day. The day the executions were scheduled to begin. He ate a cold meal of dried meat and hard bread, drank water from his canteen, and checked his equipment one final time. The rifle was clean and loaded. the pistol rode secure in its holster. The smoke grenades and breaching charges were properly packed. Everything was ready. He was ready. He looked at Kilo, who sat alert and focused, his amber eyes bright in the pre-dawn darkness. This dog had been bred, raised, and trained for this exact moment. Dalton had spent years preparing him, knowing that one day he would need to find the right soldier and lead them to this place. Now that day had come, and the dog showed no fear, no hesitation. Only purpose. Marcus reached out and placed his hand on Kilo's head, feeling the solid warmth of skull beneath fur. "We're going to save them," he said quietly, surprised at the sound of his own voice after hours of silence. "All of them. Whatever it takes." The dog's tail swished once in acknowledgement. Then he stood, shook himself, and moved to the mouth of the cave. "Ready." Marcus followed him into the cold morning air. The sun hadn't yet cleared the peaks to the east, leaving the world in that gray twilight that belonged to neither night nor day. The forest was silent, the birds not yet awake, the nocturnal creatures already returned to their dens. It was the hour when the world held its breath, when anything seemed possible. They descended from their observation point using a route Marcus had scouted 2 days prior. It took them down the back side of the ridge, well away from Site Prime's cameras and sensors, into a gully that ran parallel to the facility before curving away to the north. The going was treacherous, loose scree and patches of ice making every step a potential disaster. But Marcus moved with the careful precision of a man who knew that hurrying would only slow him down. It took 90 minutes to reach the utility building that housed the air handling system. It sat a quarter mile from the main facility entrance, connected by underground conduits but deliberately separated to prevent any malfunction from directly affecting the prison. The building itself was small, barely larger than a garden shed, with reinforced concrete walls and a steel door secured by an electronic lock. Marcus approached from downwind, staying low, using the terrain for cover. Kilo remained 10 paces behind, his head swiveling constantly, watching their flanks and rear. The building appeared unguarded, but Marcus knew better than to assume. He spent 20 minutes observing, watching for any movement, any sign of patrols or hidden cameras. He saw nothing, which meant either the security was excellent or non-existent. He was betting on non-existent. The contractors running Site Prime were arrogant, confident that their remote location and intimidating reputation provided all the security they needed. They were about to learn otherwise. Marcus moved to the door, pulling out a small electronic device from his pack. It was military-grade, designed for breaching secured facilities, and it made short work of the lock. The door clicked open, and Marcus slipped inside with Kilo right behind him. The interior was exactly as the schematics had shown, a large industrial air handler dominating the space, with control panels, filter banks, and ductwork branching off in multiple directions. He worked quickly, pulling smoke grenades from his pack and positioning them inside the main intake duct. These weren't standard military issue. Dalton had modified them, extending their burn time and increasing their smoke output. Once activated, they would pump thick, choking smoke into the ventilation system for 10 minutes, more than enough to trigger every fire sensor in the facility. Marcus set the timers for 30 minutes and activated them. Then he disabled the building's internal fire suppression system, ensuring the grenades wouldn't be extinguished by automated sprinklers. Finally, he used a breaching charge to destroy the control panel, making it impossible for anyone to override the system from this location. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it would be far too late to stop it. With that phase complete, Marcus and Kilo exited the building and began moving toward their next objective. The satellite uplink on the ridge. They climbed steadily, using game trails when possible, cutting straight up the slope when necessary. Marcus's legs burned with exertion, his breath coming in plumes of white vapor. But the physical discomfort was distant, unimportant. His mind was focused entirely on the mission, on the timing, on the dozen things that could go wrong and the contingencies he'd planned for each. They reached the uplink station just as the sun finally cleared the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with harsh morning light. The station was exactly where the schematics had shown, a small equipment shack with a satellite dish on its roof. No guards, No cameras that Marcus could see. He approached cautiously anyway, rifle up, scanning for threats. Nothing. He checked his watch. 20 minutes until the smoke grenades activated. Time to go to work. Marcus positioned himself 30 yards from the station, using a fallen log for support. Through his rifle scope, he could see the dish clearly, its surface painted to blend with the surrounding forest. One shot to the receiver assembly would be sufficient. The facility would lose all external communications in an instant, and by the time they figured out what had happened, the chaos would have already begun. He controlled his breathing, let his heart rate settle, and found that place of perfect calm that all snipers knew. The world narrowed to the view through the scope. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, applying pressure so gradually that even he couldn't predict the exact moment the rifle would fire. Then it did, the suppressed shot barely louder than a cough, and through the scope he saw the receiver assembly shatter into fragments. Phase 2 complete. Site Prime was now isolated, cut off from any backup or support. Whatever happened next, they were on their own. Marcus and Kilo moved swiftly back down the ridge, circling around to approach Site Prime from the south. His watch showed 12 minutes until the smoke grenades activated. 12 minutes to get into position at the main entrance. 12 minutes before the point of no return. They reached their final staging position with 3 minutes to spare. Marcus crouched behind a cluster of boulders that offered both cover and concealment, with a clear view of the main entrance 70 yards away. He could see 2 guards at the entrance, looking bored and cold in the morning chill. Behind them, the heavy security door stood closed, its surface designed to look like weathered wood but actually constructed of reinforced steel. Marcus pulled the rifle tight against his shoulder and settled the scope's crosshairs on the nearest guard. He didn't want to kill these men. Despite everything, despite their choice to work for a facility that imprisoned innocent people, he recognized they were probably just former soldiers trying to make a living. But he also knew they wouldn't surrender, wouldn't let him pass, wouldn't stand aside while he freed dozens of high-value prisoners. When the moment came, he would do what was necessary. He always had. His watch counted down. 2 minutes. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Then, from somewhere deep in the earth beneath his feet, he heard the first muffled alarm. The guards at the entrance stiffened, heads cocking as they listened to their radios. Their body language changed instantly from bored to alert, hands moving to weapons. One of them reached for the entrance door, beginning to pull it open, probably to investigate the alarm. That's when the door burst outward with explosive force, driven by a wall of thick gray smoke that billowed into the morning air. More alarms joined the first, creating a cacophony of warning that echoed off the surrounding ridges. The guards stumbled backward, coughing, fumbling for gas masks. Inside the facility, Marcus could hear shouting, running footsteps, pure chaos as emergency protocols collided with confusion about what was actually happening. He was moving before the smoke had fully cleared the doorway, Kilo racing beside him. They covered the 70 yards in seconds, Marcus's rifle up and tracking. The guards saw him coming but too late, still struggling with their masks, their weapons not yet raised. Marcus fired twice, controlled pairs to center mass, and both men went down. Non-lethal shots to body armor, the impact enough to knock them unconscious but not kill. He'd made that choice. He'd live with it. Then he was through the entrance, into the smoke-filled corridor beyond, with Kilo at his heel and 43 lives depending on what happened in the next 30 minutes. The mission had begun. There was no turning back now. The interior of Site Prime was bedlam. Smoke poured from every ventilation grate, reducing visibility to a few feet. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow. Alarms shrieked from speakers mounted in the ceiling. And everywhere, people were shouting, running, trying to understand what was happening. Marcus moved through the chaos like a ghost, his rifle up, clearing corners with practiced efficiency. The smoke was his ally, concealing his movements while disorienting everyone else. He followed the route he'd memorized, deeper into the facility, towards Cell Block C where Elizabeth Cormier was being held. He passed the security checkpoint, now abandoned as guards rushed toward the supposed fire. He moved through the administrative section, its offices empty, paperwork scattered across desks. He was halfway to the cell blocks when he encountered his first real opposition. 3 guards, wearing gas masks, emerged from a side corridor directly in front of him. They saw him immediately, and there was a frozen moment of mutual recognition before training took over. Marcus fired first, dropping the lead guard with a shot to the knee. The man screamed and went down, clutching his leg. The other 2 returned fire, their shots wild in the smoke and chaos. Marcus dove behind a concrete pillar, feeling rounds impact the stone inches from his head. Kilo didn't hesitate. The dog launched himself at the nearest guard with terrifying speed, hitting the man's gun arm and dragging it down. The guard tried to shake him off, but Kilo's jaws were locked, his weight pulling the man off balance. Marcus used the distraction to take down the 3rd guard with another leg shot. Then he was moving again, leaving the guards behind, injured but alive. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, and Marcus realized he'd reached the cell block junction. 3 heavy doors, each labeled with a letter. Block A to his left, Block B straight ahead, Block C to his right. All 3 stood open, the emergency protocols having unlocked them when the fire alarm triggered. He could hear voices from inside each block, prisoners calling out, asking what was happening, whether this was real or another psychological torture. Marcus moved to Block C, following the corridor deeper. Individual cell doors lined both sides, and like the main doors, they stood open. Faces appeared in doorways, pale from lack of sunlight, eyes wide with disbelief and hope and fear all mixed together. Marcus kept his rifle up but his trigger finger off the trigger. These were the people he'd come to save. Cell 17, according to the manifest. Elizabeth Cormier's cell. He found it and stepped into the doorway. A woman sat on the edge of a narrow bed, wearing gray prison coveralls, her short dark hair shot through with gray that hadn't been there in her file photo. But her eyes, those sharp eyes that missed nothing, were the same. They fixed on Marcus with an intensity that would have been unnerving if he wasn't so focused. "Are you here to kill us or save us?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse but steady. "Save," Marcus replied. "Agent Cormier, I need you mobile and armed in the next 60 seconds. Can you do that?" She was on her feet before he finished speaking. "Tell me what you need." Marcus handed her the pistol from his holster and 2 spare magazines. "Get everyone from this block together in the main junction. Anyone who can walk, anyone who can follow orders. We've got maybe 20 minutes before the guards regroup and realize this isn't a real fire." Elizabeth took the weapon, checked the chamber with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd handled firearms for decades, and nodded. "What about the other blocks?" "We evacuate everyone," Marcus said. "No one gets left behind. But C block first. Highest risk, highest value. Move." She moved. Marcus watched her stride down the corridor, all business, calling out to the other prisoners in a voice that brooked no argument. "This is real. This is your chance. Anyone who wants to see daylight again, get to the junction now." Marcus returned to the junction to find prisoners already emerging from all 3 blocks, maybe 30 people so far, blinking in the emergency lighting, looking shell-shocked. He did a quick head count and mental tally against the manifest. Not enough. There should be more. Kilo suddenly barked, a sharp warning sound, and Marcus spun to see a squad of 5 guards emerging from the administrative corridor, gas masks on, weapons raised. They saw the prisoners, saw Marcus, and opened fire without hesitation. Marcus dove for cover, returning fire, trying to keep them pinned. But there were too many of them, too well trained. This was going to get ugly. Then Elizabeth was beside him, her pistol barking as she fired with precision, targeting weapons and limbs rather than killing shots. Between them, they created enough suppressive fire to make the guards take cover. But it was a stalemate, and time was their enemy. Marcus made a decision. He pulled one of his last smoke grenades, activated it, and hurled it down the corridor toward the guards. Thick smoke billowed up, adding to the chaos. Then he turned to Elizabeth and the assembled prisoners. "Everyone, listen," he shouted over the alarms. "We're leaving now, All of us together. Stay close, stay quiet, follow my orders. Anyone who can't keep up, someone stronger helps them. We're not leaving anyone behind, but you have to move. A older man, thin and shaking, called out. They'll kill us if we try to leave. They always said they'd kill us. They're going to kill you anyway, Elizabeth shot back. The termination orders were issued 3 days ago. This man, she gestured at Marcus, is your only chance. Take it or die here. That settled it. The prisoners began moving, forming into a rough column. Marcus took point with Kilo, Elizabeth brought up the rear, and they started back the way Marcus had come. The smoke was thinning now, the grenades in the ventilation system finally burning out, but it still provided some concealment. They made it through the administrative section without contact, though Marcus could hear radio chatter and running footsteps from other parts of the facility. The guards were regrouping, starting to understand this wasn't a fire but a breakout. Time was measured in seconds now. The security checkpoint appeared through the thinning smoke. Beyond it lay the main entrance and freedom. Marcus was 5 steps from the checkpoint when the doors on either side burst open and a dozen guards flooded in, cutting off their escape route. The facility security chief, a thick-necked man with a shaved head, stepped forward with a rifle leveled at Marcus's chest. End of the line, the chief said. His voice was calm, professional. Drop your weapons. Get the prisoners back in their cells. Maybe some of you live through this. Marcus stood perfectly still, his mind racing through options. They were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. Behind him, he could feel the fear radiating from 43 people who dared to hope and were now watching that hope die. In front of him, a dozen rifles aimed at his center mass. It was over. Except it wasn't. Because Marcus Webb hadn't survived 3 tours in the worst combat zones on Earth by accepting defeat. And because he had one asset the guards didn't know about. Kilo, he said quietly. Execute. The dog exploded into motion. Kilo moved with a speed that defied comprehension, a blur of tan and black fur launched at the nearest guard's weapon hand. The dog's jaws clamped down with crushing force, and the guard screamed as his rifle clattered to the floor. Before the other guards could react, the Belgian Malinois was already pivoting, his training evident in every movement. He wasn't attacking to kill but to disarm, to create chaos, to give Marcus the split second he needed. Marcus didn't waste it. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, each one precisely placed to strike weapons rather than flesh. Rifles sparked and shattered, torn from hands by the impact. The security chief dove for cover, shouting orders, but his voice was drowned out by the renewed alarms and the screams of his own men as they scrambled away from the attacked dog who moved like liquid death among them. Elizabeth was firing too, her shots equally precise, years of FBI training evident in her controlled trigger pulls. Together, they created a corridor of suppressive fire that drove the guards back through the doorways they'd emerged from. It wouldn't last. They had limited ammunition and unlimited enemies. But it bought them precious seconds. Marcus grabbed the closest prisoner, a young woman whose name he remembered from the files as Rebecca Torres, investigative reporter. The main entrance is 40 feet ahead. Run. Don't stop. Get outside and head north into the forest. There are survival packs hidden in a cave 200 yards up the ridge. Move now. She hesitated only a moment before breaking into a run, and others followed her lead. Marcus and Elizabeth laid down covering fire as the prisoners streamed past them toward freedom. Kilo continued his assault on the guards, keeping them pinned and disorganized. The dog was magnificent, a weapon forged of loyalty and training, executing his purpose with absolute commitment. The security chief made one last attempt to rally his forces, stepping into the open with his sidearm raised. Marcus saw him and made a choice. He could shoot to wound, shoot to disable, or he could end this permanently. The chief's finger was tightening on the trigger, his weapon aimed not at Marcus but at the fleeing prisoners. Marcus shot him through the shoulder, the round spinning the man around and sending him crashing into the wall. Not a kill shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. The chief's weapon fell from nerveless fingers, and he slumped to the ground, clutching his wound and screaming orders that no one was following anymore. The last prisoner, an elderly man Marcus recognized as Thomas Brennan from the manifest, was struggling to move. Elizabeth grabbed his arm, practically carrying him toward the entrance. Marcus backed up with them, his rifle tracking for new threats, Kilo suddenly at his side again, panting but uninjured. They burst through the main entrance into bright morning sunlight that seemed impossibly harsh after the dimness of the facility. The guards Marcus had shot earlier were gone, probably crawled away to safety. Ahead, he could see the prisoners spreading into the forest, some running, some limping, all desperate to put distance between themselves and their prison. But they weren't clear yet. Marcus heard engines roaring to life, the unmistakable sound of vehicles being mobilized. Site Prime had a motor pool, and the guards would use it to hunt down the escapees. On foot in winter terrain, exhausted and unarmed, the prisoners wouldn't stand a chance. Elizabeth seemed to realize this at the same moment. "They'll run us down in minutes," she said, her voice tight. "We need to slow them down." Marcus was already moving, running not away from the facility but parallel to it, toward where he'd spotted the motor pool during his reconnaissance. Elizabeth kept pace, and Kilo ranged ahead, his senses alert for threats. They rounded a bend in the access road and there it was, a concrete building with 3 garage doors, 2 already rolling open. Inside, Marcus could see 2 SUVs and a heavy truck, all armored, all designed for exactly this kind of pursuit. He pulled his last breaching charge from his pack, armed it, and hurled it through the open garage door. It landed beneath the nearest SUV, and Marcus was already running when it detonated. The explosion was massive, far larger than it should have been. The charge must have ruptured the vehicle's fuel tank, and secondary explosions followed as flames engulfed all 3 vehicles. Black smoke poured into the sky, and Marcus felt the heat wave wash over him even from 50 yards away. That bought them time, maybe an hour before the guards could organize a foot pursuit or call in reinforcements. But reinforcements would come. This facility was too important, its secrets too dangerous. Someone would respond, and when they did, they'd have helicopters, thermal imaging, resources Marcus couldn't hope to match. He needed to get the prisoners to safety and fast. The survival packs he'd mentioned were real, hidden exactly where he'd told them. But getting 43 people, many of them weak from imprisonment, through miles of winter forest while being hunted, that was going to require more than just determination. Marcus and Elizabeth caught up with the main group of prisoners about 10 minutes later. They'd made it to the cave where Marcus had staged his supplies, and people were frantically opening the NATO packs, pulling on thermal blankets like capes, drinking from water bottles with shaking hands. Rebecca Torres, the reporter, seemed to have taken charge, organizing people, checking for injuries, keeping everyone focused. She looked up as Marcus approached. "We can't all move at the same speed. Some of these people have been in cells for years. They're weak, sick. If we try to stay together, the slowest will doom us all." Marcus knew she was right. He pulled out his GPS unit and called everyone to gather around. "Listen carefully. We're splitting into 3 groups. Group 1 is anyone who's strong enough to move fast. You're heading due north for 5 miles until you hit the logging road. Follow it west for another mile until you reach a ranger station. It's manned year-round. Get there, call for help. Group 2 is anyone who can move but needs to take it slower. You're going northeast, following the river valley. It's easier terrain, less climbing. 3 miles and you'll reach a hunting cabin. There's a radio inside. Use it. Group 3 is anyone who's injured or too weak to hike. You're staying here with Agent Cormier. This cave is defensible, stocked with supplies. Once the other groups reach help, we'll send rescue teams back for you." An older woman, her face gaunt from malnutrition, raised her hand. "What about you? What are you doing?" Marcus looked at Kilo, who sat beside him, calm and ready. "I'm buying you all time. The guards will be organizing a pursuit as we speak. Someone needs to make sure they're chasing the wrong target." Elizabeth stepped forward. "That's suicide. 1 man against dozens of trained contractors." "Not 1 man, Marcus replied. "One soldier. And the best tactical asset I've ever worked with." He gestured to Kilo. "We'll lead them east, away from all of you. Create enough noise and destruction that they won't even think to look in other directions." "You'll die," Elizabeth said flatly. "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged. "But everyone here lives. That's the mission. That's what matters." She studied him for a long moment, reading something in his face that made her slowly nod. "You were sent here by someone. Someone who knew what was happening in this place." "Captain Richard Dalton," Marcus said. "He was investigating this network. They killed him for it. But before he died, he made sure someone would finish what he started. He sent his dog to find me. And here we are." "Then finish it," Elizabeth said. "Not just the rescue. Finish the whole thing." She pulled a small drive from inside her prison coveralls. "I managed to hide this when they first brought me in. It contains everything I'd gathered on the corruption I was investigating. Names, communications, proof of conspiracy at the highest levels. Combined with whatever intelligence your captain gathered, it might be enough to burn down the entire network." Marcus took the drive, securing it in a waterproof pouch alongside the one he carried from Dalton. "Then we make sure it gets to the right people. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Sarah Jenkins, Rebecca Torres spoke up. The investigative journalist. "If anyone can break this story and survive the blowback, it's her. I've worked with her before. She's uncompromising." Marcus nodded. "Then she gets everything. But first, we get everyone to safety." The next 20 minutes were organized chaos as the prisoners separated into their groups. Marcus distributed the survival packs, ensuring everyone had water, food, and thermal protection. He gave the GPS coordinates to the leaders of Groups 1 and 2, made sure they understood the routes, emphasized the need for speed over stealth. Group 1, 12 people who were relatively healthy, set off first. They moved with purpose, disappearing into the forest within minutes. Group 2, 15 people who needed a slower pace, departed 10 minutes later, heading down into the river valley. That left 16 people with Elizabeth in the cave, the injured and the weak who simply couldn't make the journey. Marcus spent 5 minutes showing Elizabeth how to barricade the cave entrance, how to use the remaining weapons he'd left for defense, where the supplies were stored. She listened with complete focus, asking sharp questions, making sure she understood every detail. Before he left, she grabbed his arm. "What's your name?" "The man who's about to sacrifice himself for a bunch of strangers he's never met." "Marcus Webb. Former Army Ranger." "And you're not strangers. You're exactly the people I took an oath to protect." She nodded slowly. "Then go with God, Marcus Webb. And take care of that dog. He's the real hero in all this." Marcus turned to leave, but Kilo hadn't moved. The dog sat at Elizabeth's feet, looking up at Marcus with those intelligent amber eyes. For a moment, Marcus thought the dog was refusing to come, choosing to stay and guard the cave. But then Kilo stood, walked to Marcus, and pressed his head against his leg. A gesture of loyalty. Of partnership. Of understanding that this final mission would be the hardest. Together, they left the cave and headed east, deliberately leaving obvious tracks in the snow. Marcus broke branches, disturbed undergrowth, made his trail as clear as possible. He wanted the guards to follow him, to be so focused on catching their prey that they never thought to search in other directions. It didn't take long. Less than 30 minutes after leaving the cave, Kilo's ears pricked forward and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Marcus heard them too, the sounds of men moving through the forest behind them, multiple contacts, spreading out in a search pattern. The pursuit had begun. Marcus led them deeper into the wilderness, always heading east, away from the prisoners, away from any hope of rescue. He crossed a frozen stream, the ice cracking beneath his weight, leaving obvious signs of his passage. He climbed a steep ridge, knowing his pursuers would see where he'd scrambled up the loose rock. He was leaving a trail a child could follow, and he was doing it deliberately. By midday, he'd led them 5 miles from Site Prime, into some of the most rugged terrain in the Appalachians. The mountains here were steep and unforgiving, riddled with cliffs and deep ravines. It was country that could kill you if you made a single mistake, and Marcus was counting on his pursuers to make mistakes. He found what he was looking for as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. A narrow canyon, barely 15 feet wide, with sheer walls rising 100 feet on either side. There was only one way in and one way out. A perfect kill box for anyone foolish enough to enter. Marcus positioned himself at the far end of the canyon, behind a cluster of boulders that provided both cover and concealment. He checked his rifle, his remaining ammunition, the knife in his belt. He had maybe 30 rounds left, enough for what he had planned. Kilo lay beside him, calm and ready, understanding without words what was about to happen. The first guards entered the canyon 20 minutes later. Marcus counted 6 of them, moving in a tactical formation, weapons up, communicating with hand signals. Professional, careful, exactly what he'd expected. They saw his tracks leading into the canyon and followed, confident in their numbers, confident in their training. They made it halfway through before Marcus opened fire. His first shot struck the lead guard's rifle, tearing it from his hands. The second shot hit the ground at the feet of another, sending up a spray of stone chips. Not kill shots, but warning shots, demonstrating that he had them in his sights and could have killed them all. The guards scattered, taking cover behind rocks, returning fire. But their position was terrible, trapped in the narrow canyon with limited cover, while Marcus held the high ground. He kept them pinned, firing carefully, making every shot count. He wasn't trying to kill them, just keep them occupied, keep them focused on him. More guards arrived, reinforcing those already in the canyon. Marcus counted 12 now, then 15. Good. Every guard chasing him was one guard not searching for the prisoners. Every minute they spent pinned down here was another minute for groups 1 and 2 to reach safety, another minute for Elizabeth to fortify her position. But Marcus knew this couldn't last. He was outnumbered 5-1, low on ammunition, and they would eventually flank him or call in support he couldn't counter. This wasn't a fight he could win. It was a fight he could only survive long enough to complete the mission. As if reading his thoughts, Kilo whined softly. The dog's ears were swiveling, tracking sounds Marcus couldn't hear. Then he heard it too, the distant thunder of a helicopter. They'd called in air support. In minutes, thermal imaging would spot his position, and the canyon would become his tomb. Marcus made his decision. He couldn't let them take him alive. The drives in his pack contained evidence that could destroy the entire prison network, save countless future victims. That evidence had to survive even if he didn't. He pulled out the waterproof pouch containing both drives, his and Elizabeth's. He sealed it carefully, then attached it to Kilo's collar with paracord, securing it so tightly it would take deliberate effort to remove. The dog watched him work, understanding something important was happening. Marcus knelt and looked into those amber eyes one final time. Kilo. Listen to me. You've done your duty. You found me. You helped me free those people. Now I need you to do one more thing. Run. Get as far from here as you can. Find people, good people. Show them what's on these drives. Make them understand. The dog whined again, his head pushing against Marcus's chest. A gesture of refusal. Of loyalty that transcended self-preservation. That's an order, Marcus said softly, with all the command voice he could muster. Execute and evade. Complete the mission. Go. For a long moment, the dog didn't move. The helicopter was getting closer, its rotor wash already stirring the trees. Guards were advancing again, emboldened by the approaching air support. Time had run out. Then Kilo did something Marcus would remember for whatever time he had left. The dog rose on his hind legs, placed his front paws on Marcus's shoulders, and pressed his forehead against Marcus's face. A gesture of farewell. Of respect. Of a bond that would transcend whatever came next. Then he was gone, a gray and tan blur racing out of the canyon, moving with speed and purpose, disappearing into the forest. Several guards saw him and fired, but Kilo was already gone, too fast, too skilled, vanishing into the wilderness that was his true home. Marcus felt a weight lift from his chest. The mission was complete. The prisoners were free, or would be soon. The evidence was secured and being carried to safety by the most capable courier imaginable. Whatever happened to him now didn't matter. He stood from behind his cover, his rifle lowered, his hands visible. The guards saw him and approached cautiously, weapons raised. The security chief from the facility, his shoulder bandaged but still functional, was among them. He looked at Marcus with pure hatred. "Where are they?" the chief demanded. "Where are the prisoners?" "Gone," Marcus said simply. "Free. By now they've reached help. Federal authorities will be here within the hour. And they're bringing questions you won't want to answer." The chief's face twisted with rage. He raised his weapon, finger on the trigger, clearly intending to execute Marcus on the spot. But another guard, this one wearing insignia that marked him as a supervisor, grabbed the chief's arm. "We take him alive. He's got intelligence we need. Where the others went. What he knows. Who sent him?" Marcus smiled grimly. "I'm not telling you anything. And you're running out of time. Every minute you waste on me is another minute for the evidence to get further away." "What evidence?" the supervisor demanded. "Everything," Marcus said. "Every prisoner name. Every guard identity. Every financial transaction. Every order given. Captain Dalton compiled it all before you killed him. And now it's going to bury you." He could see the fear in their eyes then, the dawning realization that their secret was no longer secret, that the walls they'd hidden behind were crumbling. The supervisor grabbed his radio, barking orders, organizing a new search pattern. But Marcus knew it was too late. Kilo was already miles away, moving through terrain no human could track him through, carrying the evidence that would destroy Site Prime and everything it represented. The helicopter landed in a clearing nearby, and Marcus was roughly hauled aboard, his hands zip-tied behind his back. As they lifted off, he looked down at the forest spreading out below, endless and green and beautiful. Somewhere down there, Kilo was running. Somewhere down there, 43 people were reaching freedom. Somewhere down there, the truth was surviving. The helicopter banked and headed back towards Site Prime, but Marcus saw smoke rising from multiple locations. The prisoners had made it. Emergency services were responding. Police, fire, probably federal agents already scrambling helicopters from the nearest field office. The supervisor saw it too, and Marcus watched hope die in the man's eyes. "It's over," Marcus said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." They landed at Site Prime to find chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the access road, their lights flashing. Federal agents in tactical gear were everywhere, weapons drawn, orders being shouted. Someone had gotten through. Someone had made the calls. And now the full weight of law enforcement was descending on the secret facility that wasn't supposed to exist. Marcus was pulled from the helicopter and immediately surrounded by FBI agents who looked at his captors with suspicion and hostility. One agent, a woman with sharp features and commander insignia, stepped forward. "Who is this man?" she demanded of the supervisor. "A trespasser. A terrorist. He attacked our facility." The agent looked at Marcus, seeing the tactical gear, the military bearing, the calm acceptance in his eyes. She made a decision. "Release him. Now." The supervisor started to protest, but more agents moved in, weapons not quite raised but the threat clear. The zip ties were cut, and Marcus's hands were free. The agent gestured for him to follow her, away from his captors, away from the facility. They walked to a command vehicle where other agents were coordinating operations. The woman turned to Marcus. "I'm Special Agent Chen. We received simultaneous calls from 3 different locations, all reporting prisoners freed from an illegal detention facility. The callers gave us coordinates, prisoner names, enough detail that we had to respond in force." "That was you." "That was the people I freed," Marcus corrected. I just gave them the opportunity. One of the callers was Elizabeth Cormier, former agent who disappeared 18 months ago. She says you walked into an underground prison alone and brought out dozens of people who were being held without charges or trial. That true? More or less. Agent Chen studied him. You know you've just kicked over the biggest hornet's nest in intelligence community history. Site Prime was completely off the books. No congressional oversight, no official budget, no paper trail. Someone went to enormous lengths to keep this secret. Captain Richard Dalton figured it out, Marcus said. Died for it. But before he did, he made sure someone would finish his investigation. He sent his dog to find me. A dog led you here. A very smart dog. Trained by a very smart man. And yes, before you ask, I have evidence. Locations of other facilities in the network. Names of personnel. Financial records. Everything you need to dismantle the whole operation. Agent Chen's eyes widened. Where is this evidence? Marcus looked toward the forest, toward the mountains, toward freedom. It's being delivered as we speak. To someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone who'll make sure the truth gets out, no matter who tries to stop it. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a safe house in Washington, D.C., recovering from his ordeal. He'd been debriefed extensively, had told his story dozens of times to dozens of agents. The investigation was expanding by the hour, with arrests being made, facilities being raided, secrets being dragged into daylight. And at the center of it all was Sarah Jenkins, the investigative journalist who'd received a waterproof package delivered by a Belgian Malinois who'd appeared at her rural home in the middle of the night. The dog had refused to leave until she'd opened the package and seen what it contained. Then he'd disappeared back into the darkness, his mission complete. Jenkins had published her first article 48 hours ago, and it had detonated like a bomb in the political establishment. Senators were calling for investigations. The Attorney General had announced a special prosecutor. 3 high-ranking intelligence officials had already resigned. And every hour brought new revelations, new connections, new proof of conspiracy. Marcus watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. It was over. The mission was complete. The prisoners were safe, receiving medical care and counseling. The network was being dismantled. Justice was being served. A knock at the door made him turn. Agent Chen entered, and with her was Elizabeth Cormier, looking healthier than when Marcus had last seen her, wearing civilian clothes and a determined expression. The Bureau wants to offer you a job, Chen said without preamble. Consultant position. Help us understand what we're dealing with, identify other potential sites, brief tactical teams. Marcus shook his head. I'm done with that life. Then what will you do? Elizabeth asked. Go back to your cabin in the mountains. Resume your exile. Marcus thought about that cabin, about 9 years of isolation and penance. About the man he'd been when Kilo had found him, broken and purposeless and waiting to die. That man was gone, burned away in the fires of one final mission. What remained was someone different, someone who'd remembered what it meant to fight for something that mattered. I don't know, he said honestly. But not that. Not hiding anymore. Elizabeth smiled. Good. Because I have a proposal. I'm rejoining the Bureau, but with a new assignment. Hunting down the rest of this network, finding anyone else who might be imprisoned, making sure this never happens again. I could use a partner who knows how to get things done. Before Marcus could answer, there was a commotion outside. Voices raised in surprise, a sharp bark that Marcus recognized instantly. He was at the door in seconds, pulling it open. Kilo stood in the hallway, tail wagging, looking up at Marcus with those knowing amber eyes. The dog had found him again, navigating across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain to reunite with his partner. Around his collar was tied a note in handwriting Marcus had seen before, in the video files from the bunker. Captain Dalton's handwriting. The note was simple, just a few lines, probably written months ago when Dalton had prepared everything. If you're reading this, it means Kilo found you twice. Once to bring you into the fight. Now to remind you that fighting for the right reasons is the only fight worth having. He's yours now, Marcus. Take care of him. And let him take care of you. Some partnerships are meant to last. Finish what we started. Make it count. Marcus knelt and embraced the dog, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady heartbeat, the absolute loyalty that asked nothing in return except the chance to serve. Elizabeth and Agent Chen watched from the doorway, and Marcus saw understanding in their eyes. He stood slowly, one hand resting on Kilo's head. About that proposal. I'm listening. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood on the steps of the Capitol building, wearing a suit that felt foreign and uncomfortable after so many years in isolation. Beside him sat Kilo, calm and dignified, wearing a new collar that bore no military insignia but carried the weight of everything they'd accomplished together. Inside, Congress was holding hearings on the illegal detention network. 17 facilities had been found and shut down. Over 200 prisoners had been freed. 47 individuals had been arrested and charged with crimes ranging from kidnapping to conspiracy to murder. And more arrests were coming as the investigation continued to widen. Marcus had testified the day before, telling his story to a packed chamber, to cameras that broadcast to millions. He'd spoken about Captain Dalton's sacrifice, about the courage of the prisoners who'd survived years of illegal detention, about the dog who'd been trained to be a key that opened the door to truth. Now he was waiting for the hearing to resume, for the final testimonies to be heard. Elizabeth was inside, along with dozens of the freed prisoners, all adding their voices to the historical record, ensuring that what had been done in darkness would be remembered in light. Rebecca Torres approached, the journalist who'd been among the first to escape Site Prime. She'd written extensively about her imprisonment and rescue, her articles complimenting Jenkins's investigative work. Together, they'd made sure the story couldn't be buried or forgotten. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth," Marcus replied. "That's what started this. People refusing to stay silent." She glanced at Kilo. "And thank you," she said to the dog. "You're the real hero in all of this." Kilo's tail wagged once in acknowledgement, and Rebecca laughed, a sound of pure joy that would have been impossible 6 months ago. As the sun set over the Capitol, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Peace. Not the empty peace of isolation, but the hard-won peace of purpose fulfilled. He'd been broken, had exiled himself to protect others from his brokenness. But Kilo had found him and shown him that broken things could be made whole, that soldiers could fight for justice instead of just survival, that redemption was possible even for those who'd given up hope. He looked down at his partner, his friend, the living embodiment of one good man's final mission. Together, they'd freed the imprisoned, exposed the corrupt, and reminded a nation that some truths were worth any sacrifice to reveal. The mission was complete. The war was won. And for the first time since before his final deployment, Marcus Webb looked toward the future and saw not darkness, but possibility. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.